Welcome to the second episode of the Ithacast. I'm Duxlin Nguyen.
I'm Seth Murtaugh.
And with us today, we have Bryan McCracken, Historic Preservation Planner for the City of Ithaca. We're going to talk about historic preservation, of course, and most specifically, the Nines, which is up for designation soon.
So, Bryan, I think a lot of people in Ithaca would be surprised to learn that the city actually has a historic preservation planner on its staff. So I thought maybe we could start out with you explaining a little bit about what your responsibilities are as the historic preservation planner.
All right. So as the historic preservation planner, I am responsible for reviewing applications for exterior alterations to locally designated properties. It's my responsibility to determine whether something can be reviewed at the staff level or whether it has to go to the full commission for review. Typically, if it's a minor alteration, it's something that I can approve and, a building permit can be issued that day. If it's something more extensive, a larger project, then I refer it to the Landmarks Commission for review. Other responsibilities include applying for grants to do preservation-related work, like surveying historic properties, and also any city projects that relate to historic properties. It's my responsibility to look at them and comment on any potential impacts they may have on historic resources.
So you mentioned the commission. This is the ILPC. At City Hall, we like to throw around these acronyms. We have the BPW, we have PEDC, and we have the ILPC, which stands for the Ithaca Landmarks Preservation Commission. So what is your job to staff the ILPC meeting? So what is the commission, as you put it?
Okay, so the commission, the ILPC, is made up of 7 voting members, a secretary, that's me, and typically a common council liaison. Formerly,
I did do that for a year.
It's currently Donna Fleming. And usually one other staff member is there to record the proceedings. The commission, as I said, has 7 members. Many of them have special qualifications related to historic preservation. So there is a woman who has or is receiving her PhD in historic preservation planning. There is another woman on the commission who has her undergraduate degree in historic preservation and her master's in planning. There are also real estate agents that specialize in the sale of historic properties, as well as owners of historic properties and landlords who own designated properties. So they bring a lot of expertise to the table that they use when evaluating proposals for exterior alterations to their buildings.
One of the things I've always noted about Ithaca is that there's a really strong record of saving historic buildings from the wrecking ball in this community, and I think a very proud record. And there's a lot of people who are very strong supporters of historic preservation. You've got groups like Historic Ithaca, obviously, that do a lot of work. I wonder maybe if you could say a little bit, to the extent that you're aware of that history, a little bit about the historic preservation efforts in Ithaca's past.
Right. So preservation in Ithaca really began in the 1960s, 1970s urban renewal era. The city witnessed the demolition of several significant properties. The Cornell Library, which used to be located next to, on Bank Alley. There's
a parking lot there.
There is a parking lot there now. It was Ezra Cornell's first philanthropic gift to the city, and it was apparently an incredibly beautiful building, both internally and externally, and it was demolished.
This is what blows my mind. How could anybody ever do that? Because I've seen old pictures of this thing, and it's beautiful. Yeah. I mean, the idea that you could demolish something of such beauty is astonishing to me.
And when the city was incorporated in 1888, the council members at the time saw its beauty and recognized its beauty and incorporated it into the city seal. So that's the building that's on every city logo that you see.
That's interesting.
It's not the former City Hall.
So it's not the City Hall. I didn't know that. No. See what you learn on the Ithacast.
Yeah. So, and speaking of the former City Hall, that's another property that was demolished and
to put up a parking garage.
Residents in Ithaca saw the loss of these beautiful resources, and they created this effort to preserve some of the other landmarks that were left. And so one of the crowning jewels of preservation success is the Clinton House. Mm-hmm. It was in a bad state of disrepair. Historic Ithaca, in its infancy, purchased the building and began an extensive renovation and rehabilitation of the building. And that really was the starting point of the preservation movement in Ithaca. And from there, the city adopted a landmarks ordinance I believe in the mid-1970s, and then designated its first districts in the mid-70s as well. DeWitt Park, I think, was 1976, so very early. And from there, buildings began to be saved. Boardman Hall, which had been, formerly part of IC, was purchased by the county, and they were planning on demolishing it. And there was a groundswell of citizen outcry over its demolition, and they were able to save the building. DeWitt Mall, I believe, was another property that was threatened with demolition, and it's now a very successful, mixed-use building.
And so this all started as a reaction against urban renewal, it
Right.
sounds like. Do you know, what was the rationale that the city leaders at the time used when they wanted to demolish these buildings? Was it like a maintenance or upkeep issue?
At the time of flight from the city, people were moving out to the suburbs. You had suburban malls being built, and people were moving out and doing more shopping at those suburban malls rather than downtown.
Right.
And so there were vacancy issues, and there were, blight issues. And so people saw urban renewal as a way of clearing out some of that blight and making a path for people to revitalize the downtown and the city.
It's one of my least favorite euphemisms, urban renewal. It blows my mind that we got rid of a lot of 4 or 5 story buildings, replaced them with single story buildings, and now in the 21st century,
parking lots in
that's
some
right,
cases.
exactly,
Or parking garages.
even worse. And
Yeah.
now in the 21st century, we are trying to go back to walkable, dense, multi-use buildings.
I think the conversation used to be where are we going to put the cars, and now the conversation is where are we going to put the people.
Yeah.
Exactly. We're returning to
Right.
it's like the Jane Jacobs thing of human-centered cities.
And that's what I think a lot of people take these efforts for granted. I mean, I don't think people realize that like there was a point when the DeWitt Mall could have been demolished. I mean, that might have been, and who knows what would have taken its place. Like when you think about it now, it's just such an iconic part of the downtown, and like you can't imagine downtown without it.
Right.
And I think I view historic preservation as, I know sometimes, the historic preservation camp gets pitted against the economic development camp, but I think they're really hand in glove with each other.
I do. I agree with you. I think that preservation often gets viewed as a way to oppose change or a way to stop development, and it's seen as a very sentimental activity, which is not my perspective on preservation at all. If it was purely to preserve buildings that are beautiful, I'm not interested in a beauty pageant. I'm really interested in how preservation can help revitalize communities, how it can keep them vibrant. There's so much focus on what a building looks like, but is there a conversation about how does that building impact the economy? If it's a designated historic resource and you have to do work on it, you're typically using local labor, highly skilled local labor that demands a higher salary or wage than your traditional contractor. What is its impact on heritage tourism?
This is economist Richard Florida's big topic, Rise of the Creative Class. And he talks a lot about how historic buildings are part of the economic fabric of a city, can attract people, tourists, and give a city character.
It was what gives your city uniqueness. I mean, because you think about like people come to Ithaca, they don't come here to go visit Route 13. I mean, Route 13 looks like every other strip across the country. There's nothing unique about
Absolutely.
it, right? But our downtown is really unique, and one of the big reasons it's unique is that it's got these historic buildings, and that is a big driver for tourism, for economic development, as you're saying.
Absolutely. I mean, it is. A city's historic fabric is very important to its identity. It even outside of the commercial districts, our neighborhoods are built with unique residences that you're not going to find the same one in another community, and that's what makes us unique, and that's something that we should highlight as we grow and as we attract people.
But let me play devil's advocate for a moment here. If I live in the DeWitt Park Historic District, Why can't I just do it's my house? Why can't I do it with what I want to my porch?
Thanks, Duck.
It's a good question.
It is a good question.
Yeah.
So your porch is absolutely your property, but it also contributes to the overall character of the neighborhood, and it contributes to the vibrancy of that community and the population that lives there and that does business there. And so if you change your porch, you're not only impacting your property, but you're impacting the character of the whole.
But this is an expensive city to live in, and these restrictions make it difficult for me to afford to maintain my property.
If you are an owner-occupied property...
Duck's really good at playing the devil's advocate. I just want to point that out.
If you are an owner-occupied property, there are state incentive programs that can help you, which are at risk right now. So support the state homeowner tax credit program. But if you own your home and you want to change your porch, there's a 20% tax credit for you to do that work, to offset some of the cost of maintaining that porch. If you are a commercial property, there are both state and federal incentive programs that can help you. 20% state and a 20% federal income tax credit that can cover essentially 40% of rehabilitation costs, major rehabilitation costs of a historic property. There's also a local property tax abatement. So if the work that you're doing raises the assessed value of your property, you are eligible for a local property tax abatement on that increase in assessed value.
That's great, actually, because we get a lot of questions about abatements for smaller property owners, not just the ones building massive new projects. How about the fact that a lot of the houses in Ithaca are not that attractive? I mean, even my house was just workforce housing for laborers. This is a bit of a leading question because you gave a great answer about this with regard to a very controversial topic, Chacona, and I liked it a lot.
I think that aesthetics are purely a personal opinion, and the way that historic resources reflect the character of a community is really important and should be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Ithaca may not have a collection of the most high-style properties in the state or in the country. Some of them were just worker housing. Some of them were just Sears catalog houses that were constructed to provide housing for people who wanted to live in the community. But they clearly reflect the history of Ithaca and how it grew into the city that it is today. I think you're referring to our discussion about the Chacona Block and how some people felt that it wasn't an attractive building. I disagree. But I believe that it is a great example of what a community member did that met his own needs, that met the needs of the community, and it clearly reflects the history of the community in that particular neighborhood.
All right, since we're on the subject of the Chacona Block, just for the sake of anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about, this was a very, very contentious vote on Common Council a few months ago. And what I found sort of confusing about it was that term Chacona Block, because I've lived in Ithaca a long time, and I've never called it that before. If I was to call it something, I would probably say Collegetown Bagels in Collegetown. If I was referring to the building, I'd probably say the Collegetown Bagels building.
So it's interesting that you said that you didn't recognize the name, but until probably the 1960s, 70s, it was recognized as that. So the building was named after the person who built it, John Chacona. He came to America as a very young boy from Greece, and he came to Ithaca and established a very successful business with his, I believe it was his cousin. And, through that success, he was able to raise the capital and, the support of a local bank, which was incredible at the time, to build the Chacona Block. And
so it was known as the Chacona Block.
It was historically known as the Chacona Block.
Wow, that's interesting. Wow.
And somehow, 1960s that got lost. I'm not sure why. Some of the buildings that have names like that, it's clearly imprinted on the building. The Griffin Block. People recognize that as Simeon's. But the really important thing about John Chacona is that he was a Greek immigrant that came here with nothing, came to a country that wasn't exactly supportive or wasn't willing to embrace Greek immigrants. Shortly after he arrived, the federal government enacted limitations on the number of people that could come from Greece to America. In communities like ours, Greek immigrants were kind of shunned. They formed their own communities, and they didn't have the warm welcome that John Chacona did.
Yeah, and just to kind of give a little bit of context, I mean, what happened was that the Ithaca Landmarks Preservation Commission, I think with the support of the historic preservation community here in Ithaca, recommended that we designate this building in Collegetown, the Collegetown Bagels building, as I call it, or the Chacona Block, as a historic building. And the property owner is Student Agencies, which is a nonprofit. They do a lot of good work with a lot, mostly Cornell students, although I think they're not affiliated with Cornell.
They work with Cornell students, but they don't receive funding from Cornell, and their services do extend beyond the Cornell population. So they do have things they have moving services and things that help local residents.
So they get most of their income comes from the rents on this building, and they had an interest in redeveloping it. So demolishing the current structure that's there and building up. We approved new zoning, which I think allowed for a height increase. So they wanted to redevelop it, build a new building, and then the rents that they would get from that would help to sustain their mission, their organization. So it turned into this big fight. With the ILPC made its recommendation on Common Council, we kind of split into two camps: those supporting the designation, which Duxon did and I did, and those who were supporting the redevelopment, kind of led by Alderman Steve Smith of the 4th Ward, or as I like to call him, Alderman Steve I Hate History Smith. But Steve's a friend of mine, so I feel like I can rib him a little bit. But it got very, very contentious on council, and we took a vote, and it was 5-5, and the mayor broke the tie. So on Common Council, when we have a 5-5 vote, the mayor breaks the tie. And this is I can't tell you how rare this is, that this happens. It's so unusual. I think I've been on Common Council for 6 years. I could probably count on one hand the amount of times that we've had a split vote like that.
So there was a split vote for stone sidewalks in the East Hill Historic District.
So something about historic preservation that sort of brings out these split votes.
Yeah.
So split votes, very, very rare. Doesn't happen very often. And in this case, the mayor voted against the designation, which meant that the designation didn't pass. I got to say, I was pretty cut up over this one because I really got pretty passionate about it and believing that building should be preserved. I realized that 5 of my colleagues on Common Council feel differently.
I was very much on the fence. It was really difficult.
It was a very tough vote.
And at some point I knew that, here's a little, I guess, inside baseball. I did not expect Donna Fleming to vote against designation. And when she did, I pretty much knew it was over because I knew at 5-5 the mayor was going to, he had said at planning, at your committee stuff, that he opposed designation. And so I knew at best it'd be a tie and that, he would vote in that direction. And so it was dramatic for sure for multiple reasons.
And I think it was dramatic for us too because we're a pretty collegial group. We don't usually have this level of contention. I mean, we have lots of debates, healthy debates, but this one got pretty contentious. It was like what the county legislature does at every single one of their meetings, right? It's but we're not like that. We're a little more collegial than they are, and so it was a tough one, I think, for sure. But the funny thing is, I think after the whole thing was done, I mean, it took us months. I felt like we were debating this thing. We got all these people writing us, people writing on behalf of student agencies, people, Cornell alums writing us, telling us to vote for the designation. There was a hashtag at one point, hashtag Chacona Forever. I was pushing that on Twitter a little bit. It got, there's some trash talk between Steve Smith and I. It got pretty intense. And after the dust was settled, we're all kind of thinking, okay, we can take a breather. And it turns out that literally 4 months after this whole thing, we're now dealing with what is potentially another controversial historic designation in Collegetown. So Bryan, let me ask you, what is it? This is the upcoming Nines designation. What is it about Collegetown and these historic designations?
So the ILPC is focused on Collegetown right now because they see that any historic resources left in Collegetown, which I should note there are very few that I feel are eligible for designation, they're threatened. There is a huge push for development in Collegetown. Real estate values are incredibly high, and if the ILPC doesn't act now, they're going to lose any opportunity to designate anything or keep anything of historic merit in College Town. There's a development proposal, what we can expect from that, and there is a designation, and so it's another contentious moment.
So we're going to be talking about this at the next Planning and Economic Development Committee, March 14th. So mark your calendars, 6 p.m., March 14th in council chambers at City Hall. The Nines designation will be on the agenda. And the question, so let's talk about the Nines. I mean, this one is a little bit different. I think that, there's my sense when the whole Chacona debate was going on is that there seems to be more community support for designating the Nines potentially, because the building has this history. I mean, it was a fire station, and it's I feel like I can sense a little bit more support potentially for the Nines.
I would agree. I think more people understand its significance. More people understand why it's important. The building still reads very much as a fire station. If you even hear a whisper about what the building used to be, you can look at the building and tell that, that makes absolute sense. Of course it was a fire station.
A lot of I think the interest in preserving the history and the culture there is kind of attached to the business. But we're really not talking about the business, right? We're talking about the building itself. So I guess my question to you, and I get maybe the wider historic preservation community, is to what extent should your attachment to a particular business enter into your decision to designate something? Is that something that's like completely irrelevant?
That's a good question. I think that in any property, it's impossible to divorce the current use of the building from its historic use. And from the Chacona Block and the College Town Bagel connection and the student agencies connection to, the Nines fire station and the Nines restaurant, it's very difficult to separate the two. But in some ways, that does become a part of the historic record. It becomes a part of the conscious memory of the building. In my opinion, I think that, if you're looking at designating a building, you shouldn't look at its current use. You shouldn't look at the current businesses there. You shouldn't look at the current property owner. You should look at the resource and the resource only. And does its historic merit warrant designation? That's very difficult to do. There's no way to preserve the Nines business if the property owners or the business owners don't want to sell the business or don't, pass that legacy on to someone else. And they're in no way obligated to do so.
What about the owners who bought it in 1980, looking forward to this massive windfall that they can only get if the person they sell it to can develop the 6-story building that they are proposing?
Yes. Did they have a crystal ball, and could they see that the value of that property was going to be, 100 times what they paid for it in 1980? I doubt that.
Nor could they have predicted, to devil's advocate myself, nor could they have predicted council's actions to rezone all of College Town.
Absolutely. I was just going to mention that. The value of that property is based on the upzoning of that neighborhood. If it was a property in any other neighborhood in the city, it would not have that value. But because it was upzoned and because it's in College Town, it has that perceived value. The value of the property, if it was to remain as it is $775,000. That's still an incredible price for a building that has a restaurant in it and really no other use.
So it's actually two buildings, which people may not realize. The rear part is wood frame and older, and the front part is brick.
That's correct. So the 1894-95 portion of the building was built to meet the demands of the neighborhood. It took nearly 30 minutes for any kind of firefighting services to make it up the hill to fight fires, which is pretty incredible for a neighborhood where most of the buildings were wood framed and one spark could ignite a fire that would completely devastate a neighborhood. So in a partnership, the Cornell community and residents on East Hill formed a fire company, the W.H. Sage Hose Company, which became the number 9 fire station. The the architecture firm of Vivian and Gibb donated the designs for the first fire station in Collegetown, and it was built on Dryden Road, the corner of Dryden Road and College Avenue. And it served its function for about a decade, and then pretty quickly after it was built, the city realized and the community realized that that fire station was not adequate to serve Collegetown. So they entered into negotiations with another property owner in Collegetown. He traded land and paid to have the fire station moved to the land that he offered to the city. And then the city built an addition to the building, which is the what is visible from College Avenue today, the brick and stucco building, in 1907, 1908. And that is it was designed by another important firm in Ithaca, Gibb and Waltz. I mentioned these architecture firms, and you're probably now familiar with their other works, but for Vivian and Gibb, they're responsible for the Cascadilla Boathouse and the pavilion complexes at Stewart Park. So, buildings that really revolutionize the character of the waterfront. For the addition to the building, which was designed by Gibb and Waltz, they're responsible for the Masonic Temple downtown and Rand Hall on the Cornell University campus. So both firms had pretty significant commissions that really shaped the architectural character of the community.
So the building is divided it's two separate buildings, and my understanding is that the rear of the building is in much worse shape than the front of the building. So this question has come up among the Common Council about whether it would be possible to segment it. But your understanding is this isn't something that's typically done.
It's not something that's typically done. You designate the tax parcel. So there's no way to segment the designation to designate only a portion of it. There are other ways to look at the property. There are other resources in historic districts where a portion of the property is considered contributing or, reflects the historic past of the property, and other portions of the property that are non-contributing or do not reflect that historic past. The condition of the building is a tricky subject,
right?
I think for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think because this also came up with the Chacona Block. This question of, because student agencies, the owner was saying that the property was in terrible shape, and using that as a justification for why you'd want to demolish it. You look at, we were saying before, there's a lot of cases in Ithaca's past where you have buildings, historic buildings, incredible buildings like the Clinton House that were in really bad shape, but they were designated because it was recognized that they added value to the community. I think personally, this is my personal view, that that argument that a building is dilapidated or deteriorated is not always a great case for why it should not be designated.
I would agree. I think that to allow a property owner's neglect of a property to be used as an out for a designation is really unfair to other property owners in the city who maintain their properties regardless of any anticipated gain in property value in the future.
I have a question just about the future designations in the city, because we've been focusing a lot on Collegetown. It does seem like Collegetown is kind of becoming like the Alamo of the historic preservation community. There's been a lot of attention on it and rallying around these projects. What about the rest of the city? I mean, when I think about, Duck and I represent the Second Ward, I think there's a lot of opportunities for historic designation in the Second Ward. I think people would be surprised to learn that the north facade of the Commons, for instance, isn't historically protected. I was told I was having a conversation with John Guttridge last night, who told me that the Elks building, the Cornell Daily Sun building, isn't locally designated. I mean, that actually really surprised me, because that seems like such a iconic building downtown. I mean, so are there opportunities for the ILPC and I guess you to sort of expand your horizon beyond Collegetown and maybe focus on some other areas of the
absolutely
city?
And we are looking, or at least I'm looking at other properties outside of Collegetown. So the planning committee recently reviewed a grant application for an expansion of the East Hill Historic District to include properties on Aurora Street and Lynn Street and East Court Street. That's certainly not in College Town. The Commons is perennially a focus. We recognize its historic value. It is listed on the National Register of Historic Places, but it isn't locally designated, so it doesn't have the same level of protection as a locally designated resource. But again, it's all about where the threat is, and if there was an infinite amount of money and an infinite amount of staff resources, it would be easy to designate all of the buildings that are worthy of designation in the city.
Well, I think that may be a wrap. I mean, I really do appreciate the work that you're doing. I think it's, I mean, as you said, I think it's incredibly important for the history of our city, for the culture of our city. And I think that, I'm very appreciative of your work, and also the ILPC's work. I think it is something that, adds an incredible amount of value to our community.
I agree. I mean, I'm very pro-development. I love seeing the new buildings that are rising throughout the city. I think progress is great, but that there's economic and cultural value in preserving some of the history of the city too.
I think it's a great point to make that preservation doesn't stop development. It can complement development. I would argue that no preservationist believes that every old building should be designated. It's important to preserve buildings that have that contribute to the character of the community and that reflect its historic past. But in order for a neighborhood or a community to remain vibrant, there is an understanding that there has to be a certain amount of change. And I think that preservation and change can complement each other, and that's something that gets often lost in the conversation.
Well said.
Well said. Let you have the last word. Thank you so much, Bryan, for joining us today. We really appreciate your insight and the background that you gave us today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
It's a wrap.